Hello there, caught you peeking. This right here is a tin whistle that I picked up recently from a Renaissance fair. But we're not here for tin whistles. We're here for swords. This sword is the Todd Cutler Swirk. Give you a quick look there. Look how beautiful this is. This thing is an absolute beast. When I first picked it up, or when I first saw it online rather, Todd Cutler put out his beautiful video about Scottish Dirks, and that he'd started to make some fantasy pieces associated with that. And this was one of those that immediately caught my eye. Taking a look there. Absolutely beautiful. Let's go ahead and dispense with the scabbard. And just have a look here at the blade. Now the blade comes up to about my waist, so it's quite long for an arming sword. We're sharp all along the end here. It has a cut out false edge here on the end, but that hasn't been sharpened, which is unfortunate because that would be an absolutely beautiful spear point right there once it was. So once I get that sharpened, I'm sure I'll post some more videos. Now this sword is a fantasy piece. It didn't exist in history. This type of a sword was more associated with, this type of design was associated more with Scottish daggers called Dirks. And if you've ever seen traditional Scottish Highland dress, you know exactly what a Dirk looks like. It's the one that they have tucked into their belt. It's a big long dagger that pretty much all the Scottish people wear. It's a remnant of medieval times. You can see up here at the top how that looks very much similar to a lot of the medieval bollock daggers that people were using fighting in armor all the way up from around the 1400s up until about the 1700s. And dirks of about dagger size were issued all the way up until the 1900s to Scottish regiments. So this type of a sword we've talked about is obviously a fantasy sword, but it is totally incredible to behold. Now this type of a sword is fairly weighty, so I'm probably a little bit too English to be wielding this sword, just because it is probably just a little bit long for me. The blade quality is great. You can see here we have that lovely ribbed back right there. I'm pretty sure that's just designed on this sword. I'm not sure if there's any kind of function to the original design of that. Perhaps something like a sawback blade in Napoleonic times or something like that. It is a single-edged sword, and it is quite beefy. You can look down there at the profile of that sword. That right there is probably about 1/8 of an inch thick at the base, and it tapers all the way down to about 1/16 of an inch towards the tip. So it does have really good distal taper. If I was twice the man that I was, this would be a very good sword to wield around. But as I hold it in my hand, it feels powerful. Now, usually Dirks are more like this size, where it's about 1.5 hands, 2 hands width, 3 hands width going up the blade. It was used as a backup weapon or as a weapon people would use on the battlefield as kind of a last resort. But it's also kind of like an everyday eating man's knife. So it was really more of a popular with lower status soldiers. But as time went on, it became more and more popular. As we go higher status, Matt Easton recently posted a video of a super high status Dirk. Absolutely stunning works of art. So I really like what Todd Cutler had done with this specific model that he made. This one's made by Joshua von Warbear he's associated with Sterling Armory. Really good quality dagger. But this sword, right here, is actually amazingly good quality. So I find this to be kind of in the budget range. I believe I paid about $400 for this sword. And if you really want to wow people at your next Scottish Highland Games, as long as it's legal, you can wear a Dirk that's more sword-sized, which is incredible, and it's really just kind of a showpiece. Now, I wore this around at the Renaissance Fair this last weekend out in Tooele, and I got a lot of really cool looks where people were like, wow, is that a real sword? Is that cool? Some of the guys dressed up in the Scottish tartan kilts were like, is that a Dirk? I'm like, well, I mean, kind of. It's more of a sword, you know what I'm saying? So walking around with this, it was definitely a showpiece. And that bronze here on the hilt really kind of suits it to showing off to your friends, which is very, very important in a sword wearing context, especially in the modern day. With this being a fantasy piece, I wouldn't recommend going into combat with it against other swords. We are missing that crossguard, which is why you see as we get into bigger swords, the crossguard or the handguard gets a little bit more well-defined to help protect against blades sliding down here. Now, I wouldn't think this is a particularly good dueling weapon. It is quite heavy, so you'll see me here scrolling some B-roll as we go through it. But because the sword is so heavy, I have a really hard time cutting around and redirecting the point. It does not feel like a saber. It feels much more like a machete. But oh man, if this lands on your target, it is going to remove chunks of them. You can see here that I actually hit my stand, and I barely even feel it. Checked along the blade, it doesn't look like I have any damage whatsoever. One thing that I don't necessarily like too much about Todd Cutler blades, it might just be the type of steel that he has, is it does stain fairly easy. So I cleaned, it's kind of hard to see, I cut a pumpkin with this and I cleaned it off about 20 minutes ago. It looks like it's definitely etched the blade a little bit, so that's going to take some polishing to buff out. But if you keep this well maintained, it's going to be an absolutely beautiful sword. So I would highly recommend this to anyone that wants to either show off, have a really powerful cutting sword, or wants to be a little bit more Scottish than me and showing that it can cut the sword a lot better. Now, if this existed in a more historical context, what kind of period would we place it into? Well, Todd Cutler is a lot better about this, but he made his video about kind of a context where a sword like this could have existed. 1400s to 1700s would be my guess. Now, around that time, we have what's called the Jacobite Revolution, which is really just it is a period in Scottish history that is really trying to restore more of the Roman Catholic Church over the Protestant Church that the English are foisting upon the Scottish. So you have Bonnie Prince Charlie. He comes over. He's working a lot with the chieftains and stuff like that to try and overtake the parts of the English that are over top of Scotland, causing some problems. And they're very famous for what's called the Highland Charge, which is really let's fire our muskets and we're going to charge the heck out of them, because we're fighting against an army that's very well trained, and we're not particularly skilled general forces. At this time, they're fighting more with things like Lochaber axes, with people just picking up weapons that may be a few hundred years old, wearing whatever they can. The most iconic image that you have of that would be something like a targe. This is the cold steel targe, which I think is kind of a poor quality representation. And then they'd have a basket-hilted broadsword. So imagine a sword like this, but it has a big full basket on. You imagine kind of a rapier with more of a broadsword blade. That's actually where we get our term broadsword, is it's a sword that's more broad on the distal taper than it is skinny with something like a rapier, which would be contemporary with that. So you have sword, broadsword, because it's broad. So if this had a basket hilt on it, it would fit very comfortably into some of this Jacobite Revolution era, where they have the targe and the sword. So we have our muskets, we fire our muskets, drop the musket, draw our swords, and through the smoke of the musket fire, we charge into the British lines. They talk about that thin red line because at this time, the people that they're sending are not necessarily the premier recruits to go up and help enforce English law on the Scotland. A lot of them are either Scottish militia troops or they are low-trained, newly recruited English soldiers, and they charge not very frequently. So many of them, this would be their first period of combat that they would have been in. And me as a Scottish person, I'm very familiar with clan warfare, going around stealing my neighbor's cattle, taking away pieces of property from them, things like that. So I have at least some experience martially over what the English would have had. They are very well trained, very well drilled, but they do have quite a large issue with competing against a very determined, a very forward-moving force that has a lot of inertia. So this Scottish charge was made famous, this Highland charge was made famous during the Jacobite Revolution. And because of that's kind of where the name comes from. It's that Highland charge, because it was a lot of these people that come from the Highlands in this more dense fighting formations. Typically, if you can meet that formation at an immediate point, it's a lot easier to break them. How would one go about fighting with weapons like this? So let's imagine this as an arming sword for a minute, and we'll imagine this is kind of a buckler. It's a lot bigger. In this context, we're going to be fighting mostly against like I said, English people armed with bayonets. So for our purposes, imagine it's somewhat of like a very unwieldy spear. They'll shoot, takes about 20 seconds to reload, shoot again. So the objective for people like me would be, we have our muskets. They're probably less good than the brown vesses that would be used against us. Fire the musket, drop the musket. There's a big smoke screen in front of us. This big smoke screen will obscure us to any kind of forward troops that the English might be having. And then we would draw our sword right here and then charge. Primarily because we're facing the bayonets. Really, they're only going to get one stab at you because they're so unwieldy. So if I could take my targe and really kind of push their brown vest muskets down, this becomes an extremely useful weapon. So they're wearing thick clothing. So swords like this would deal very, very well against cloth armor or just thick clothing. Some of them might be wearing something underneath their hat, especially earlier Jacobite days, or earlier Scottish days, that can defend against things like a sword, but mostly your face is completely open, your torso is going to be completely open, covered by your red coat. So really, if I can suppress that musket, or I can suppress that first attack of the bayonet, and then I can stab, I can cut, I can do all kinds of things that a bayonet won't be able to easily return. So the one thing that troops that would be carrying a sword like this, or a basket-belted broadsword, would really have to be aware of is they're likely going to face some very high initial casualties while charging at their opponents. But after that first initial casualty, those initial casualties have dropped. If we can impact that line with force and with fury, a lot like the Gallic soldiers during the times of Julius Caesar, if we can hit there and stay at least a little bit cohesive, they're most likely going to retreat. And really, at the end of the day, if you can get your opponent off the field, you will win that battle. So with a weapon like this, it is very much a devastating, chopping weapon. We want to make sure that we're not having any issues involved with having to deal with more nimble weapons, things like sabers or rapiers. But if I'm fighting against somebody who has a very not movable melee weapon, this I think would be an amazing choice. And nobody really wants to see a big Scottish guy charging at them, even if it is with something that's more fantasy looking like this. Because boy, oh boy, would I not want to get hit with that. And you can see here that when I stab this pumpkin, it very easily penetrates all the way up to there. And obviously, pumpkin's not a super good analog for a person, but imagine that going into you. That would be absolutely brutal. So I don't think if I was an English recruit that I would be willing to stand against a charge of people like this, which kind of helps me identify that kind of historical context would make the most sense for a weapon like this. Would I take this into a fight? Not this weapon personally, just because we know that I am not nearly as strong as I should be. Part of that's because of the surgery. The other part of that is probably because this is meant for somebody that'd be significantly bigger, stronger, more powerful, much more combat attuned than I am. So I think this weapon is awesome. If you want to show off to your friends, 100% I would buy it. This is a great sword to just do some backyard cutting with, or to train how to use more nimble swords more accurately. This is a great weight trainer where, just like the Romans did, your sword weighs twice as much as it does for a normal weapon. For the normal weapon you'll be fighting with, it makes it especially easy for you to fight. Cultures all over the world have done this. We talk about the Spartans going into battle, that their training regimen was so harsh that going into battle was actually like a rest for them. And having that mentality of, oh, this feels light in my hand right now, does a lot for your morale, especially if you're a troop based on specifically getting in close and smacking people down. Something that most troops of the era would not be super happy with. So Sparta did that. The Romans are super famous for having swords that are twice their weight, going up against and training with those. So I think a weapon like this is great for training. It's great for showing off. It is a showpiece. It is absolutely beautiful. Yeah, everyone should go buy it. I think Todd Cutler does an amazing job. All the products that I've had of his, the ones that we reviewed on the channel, have been awesome. He's rock solid. He rings like a bell. The leather is nice and good. That brass or that bronze looking thing is awesome. He's done some really good stuff. You can see rapine here on the end. But yeah, I mean, I think everyone should have a sword like this.